Ara, en continuació, tindrem el Richard Rogers. En Richard Rogers es profesor de Nuevos Medios y Cultura Digital en el Departamento de Media Studies de la Universitat d'Amsterdam. He barrejat el català i l'anglès, disculpeu. Ai, el català i l'anglès, ja no sé ni què parlo. Ha fet diverses publicacions, entre elles Information Politics on the Web, que va guanyar el Premi MIT el 2004 i Digital Methods també el 2013. És director de la iniciativa de mètodes digitals, Digital Methods Initiative, que desenvolupa programes d'estudis en base als mètodes digitals, que consisteix en recuperació de dades, anàlisi d'aquestes dades, visualització de dades. I el que estudia és com fer ús del medi, és a dir, internet i diferents plataformes com poden ser Twitter, Snapchat, qualsevol plataforma a través d'internet, a través del web, i els seus mètodes per a la investigació social o l'estudi digital. Consisteix bàsicament en l'anàlisi d'una plataforma i veure com fer investigació social sobre aquestes dades que tenim en aquella plataforma. Avui ell treballa transversalment també amb programadors, dissenyadors, analistes de dades. És un sector que nosaltres coneixem, però que no és arxiver directament. Ell no és arxiver, però avui vindrà a parlar del que seria arxivar el web, és a dir, tot el web archiving, que és un tema que com a arxivers ens interessa molt, i directament passem a la seva conferència. Gràcies.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm very, very pleased to be here. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the history of web archives and how web archives have reached a so-called crisis in their use. So it is oftentimes argued that web archives are underutilized or not used enough. And so what I'm going to subsequently do after explaining this crisis is talk about some solutions to it that we've developed in Amsterdam. And I want to do that by showing you some digital methods to brighten or unlock web archives. So that's where I'll conclude. But where I want to start is talking about a history of web archives. And I'm going to talk about that history in two ways. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to periodize web archives. I'm going to tell you how web archives have arisen and the kinds of historical traditions that are built into web archives. So, and then subsequently, as I said, I'm going to talk about how it has been argued that they are underutilized or hardly used. And then finally, I'm going to talk about ways in which we can build tools and software on top of web archives in order to facilitate their use by scholars. So this is the periodization of web archives that I'd like to talk about briefly. And each of these particular traditions, I would like to call them traditions of web archiving. And each of them suggest types of histories or historiographies. So there is the first one, which is the Internet Archive. And this was founded in 1996 by Brewster Kahle. And it is an archive which has a particular interface that suggests a particular way in which it should be used and ways in which history with it could or should be written. Subsequently, I'm going to talk about the special collections tradition. This is a tradition that started in 1999, and most web archives these days also make special collections. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of why it is that we think we should save events around especially elections and disasters and where that came from. Subsequently, I'll talk a little bit about what could be referred to as the national turn. That is, national libraries building web archives, and what kind of web archives come out of the national turn, and also what kind of histories can be written from these web archives. And finally, I'm going to move to the contemporary period and the problems with archiving social media, and talk a little bit about how social media is being archived, as well as the kinds of histories that are being written with social media archives. So let me start with the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive. You probably have been there before. It is archive.org. And at archive.org, what you do is you enter a single URL. And this is its interface. And what you get back this is the current interface of it, and this is the classic interface. And what you get back is all of the pages that were saved from this particular URL. So in some sense, what this Wayback Machine is affording or asking you to do is, in some sense, to explore the history of a single website or a single web page. So this is a kind of archive that sort of invites you to write website biographies. So the kind of historiography that's built in is a biographical historiography. What's interesting, I think, about the Internet Archive also is that it is a product of its time. It was, as I said, it started at around 1996, and very interestingly, it was the way in which this archive was built. It was crowdsourced. So what one did in the late 90s was you downloaded a toolbar called the Alexa toolbar, and then you installed that on your browser. And what this Alexa toolbar did was it gave you information about the websites that you were browsing live. But what it also did was it collected a list of all the websites that a user was browsing and then archived them for the Internet Archive. So it was a way in which one traded information about a website for your surfing history. What's also interesting about the way it works these days, the Internet Archive, is that you surf it. You surf through the Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine, clicking on links that take you to pages that are not exactly the same date as the page you're on, but rather to the closest date. And if that other page that's linked is not archived, then it takes you to the live web. So in some ways, it builds in surfing. So it builds in the particular period of time in which it was made, the surfer's web. So the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive is also a product of its times. The second tradition I'd like to talk about is the tradition of the special collection. The special collection is something that originated around 1998, 1999, and it's something that is quite peculiar in web archiving, because what the special collection largely does is it saves events, and it's particular kinds of events as well. So the origins of web archiving events started with this project called webarchivist.org. Webarchivist.org was a project of the University of Washington, Kirsten Foote and Steve Snyder. And what they did was they were planning on archiving the US congressional elections when suddenly 9/11 struck. So they, through agile means, were able to quickly shift the infrastructure that they had in place and began to archive a 9/11. And this is the origin of the idea that what we largely archive in terms of events are elections and disasters. Subsequently, in their saving of events, they also created collections around the Asian tsunami of 2002 and other disasters. Interestingly, they also added one other type of special event, and that's the transition. So elections, disasters, and the transition, whether it's presidential or papal. I want to talk a little bit about the technique that they used. And this is a technique that was quite influential in its day. And what they did to archive an event. How do you archive an event? They developed what they called a technique called web sphere analysis. And web sphere analysis was a way in which to demarcate a set of websites that constituted the event. And they did that in a very interesting way. They used hyperlink analysis software to map the links between websites that were all related to an event. And they also defined the temporality, the length or the duration of an event. How long does an event take place? And they measured activity on websites and determined that one should keep 30 to 40 days constitutes an event, which is a little bit different from, for example, the Russian Revolution, 7 days that shook the world, but on the web, an event, at least according to WebSphere analysis, lasts 30 to 40 days. What I want to mention, though, is WebSphere analysis was also a product of its time. So WebSphere analysis was thought up right around the time where we had the birth of the blogosphere, and the idea of the sphere became really significant. So they themselves developed a way in which to think about a web sphere in order to archive it that was inspired by the idea of the dominant metaphor of the sphere or the blogosphere of its time. Okay, so the third type of web archive that I want to discuss is the national one. And arguably, the national one has become the dominant way in which web archives are currently made. So national web archives started in the mid-90s, but really only got going in around 2000, 2001. And this is when the national libraries got involved. How does a national library look at the web? Well, it doesn't look at it as cyberspace. It doesn't look at it as events to be archived, but rather it looks at it in terms of its own portion of the web. And it's very interesting. I think the most well-known or most influential definition of a national web is the Danish. In a couple of significant papers that were written around this time, Danish web archivists decided that there is something called a Danish portion of the web, and this portion of the web is worthy of archiving. And this is, in some sense, an interesting shift in what to archive and how to archive it. So the Danish, and then this was followed by many other countries as well, decided to archive .dk and also other websites dealing with Danish subject matters, but largely with what they called Danica, or Danish heritage. So the national web archiving became a kind of heritage archiving instead of other types of archiving. This has been followed by many other national web archiving efforts, especially in Europe. There are very, very few countries in Europe which do not have national web archiving capabilities or national web archives. I want to mention how this idea of a national web was around 2001, 2002, 2003, was also a product of its times. The whole idea of a national web arguably started when a French NGO sued Yahoo. This was in 2001. They sued Yahoo because in cyberspace, so Yahoo, on its web shop at the time, you could buy Nazi memorabilia, Nazi items. And of course, to buy those sorts of items is against the law in France, but these items were in the US. And Yahoo argued, no, it's cyberspace. And the French NGO argued, no, should actually be banned in France. So what happened was that technology was developed to understand where a surfer was coming from. It's called GeoIP technology. And so one understood where a surfer was coming from, you could be redirected to a national web. So at that time, if you typed in google.com in Spain, you'd be redirected to google.es. You'd be sent home by default. So this is the era, the web era, in which national webs and national web archiving began. Okay, I want to now talk about the current era. And the current era is, of course, dominated by social media. I don't know how many of you in this room try to archive social media. Who tries to archive social media? Yeah, okay, excellent. It's not that many, actually, but good. So what I want to say about it, first of all, is the archiving of social media is something that is very difficult to do as an institution, but rather is easier to do as an individual. And this is arguably given rise to a particular kind of archive, and that is the autobiographical archive. You're archiving yourself. But before I get there, I want to show you, or I want to talk about, first of all, archiving Facebook. I don't know if you've ever seen this user on Facebook, Charlie Archivist. This is a Facebook account that has been set up by ArchiveIt, the American initiative. And this is a user who then, when one logs in, one uses this account. So this user has no friends. It is otherwise not engaged with making friends or posting or anything else, but is there solely for the purposes of archiving. So you need to log in, first of all. And then Charlie here then begins to archive. Largely, Charlie is archiving not other individuals, but pages, Facebook pages. So these can be public figures, these can be institutions, these can be NGOs, etc. Donald Trump, for example. One can archive Trump's page through Charlie. The second one is through creating what people are calling these days selfie archives. So what are selfie archives? So this is one of the most famous projects. It's not an archiving project per se, but it's a scholarly project called Selfie City. It was a project by Lev Manovich. And what he did was used Instagram and queried the hashtag selfie and the geo-coordinates of 5 cities, Moscow, Rio, Tokyo, New York, and another one, I can't remember, Berlin, and downloaded the maximum number of selfies for each city, and then did a formal analysis of the selfies, how they tilted their head, how they smile, etc., and then derived kind of city mood sentiment. So they found that Rio was particularly happy and Moscow particularly glum. And this is the kind of work that is being done with selfies. The third one that I want to talk about in archiving social media concerns recording of social media pages. So this is an idea that Rhizome came up with, the New York-based arts collective. And the idea is that you would set up, so you don't save the HTML, but rather you record the page. And you record how the news feed, for example, on Facebook is updating. You record, so it's because these sites are dynamic, these pages are dynamic. So recording as a solution. Now this gave rise to this is the very first sort of social media selfie art project, which was in the Tate Gallery in London. It's by Amelia Ullman, who created a sort of fictional character, an it girl in LA on Instagram, who went through 3 phases trying to get recognized, going a little over the top, becoming a bad girl, and then suddenly turning to yoga and things like this. And so these 3 phases were performance art on Instagram that Amelia did, and they were also simultaneously recorded using this software. So this is another idea. But most people, when they think of archiving social media in the kind of autobiographically, think about data dumps. So this is a Facebook data dump or a Google data dump, and it's interesting. I don't know if there are initiatives out there that encourage individuals to get a data dump and then donate those data dumps to archives. So this would be a way in which to build a social media archive of individual profiles, if one were to think that that were a valuable effort. But nevertheless, these data dumps are extremely interesting to look at for the individual, because the individual cannot imagine the amount of data that has been saved by these companies. Karen Hanley, who writing in the New York Times last year, said of her looking at her Facebook data that she received from Facebook, said it's like reading a diary I never intended to keep. So the amount of material in there is quite intimate, is quite delicate, etc. Now, if you get your own Google data dump, you'll be shocked, actually, as what is being kept. So this enters into interesting questions of archiving the personal. So just, I don't know if you can read that list on screen, but if you were to receive your own Google data dump, what Google has still are all your emails, all of them, even the ones you deleted, your entire search histories, the history of all the places you've been, location histories, as well as all the YouTube videos you've watched. And they have this history even if you have used incognito mode in your browser. So I mean, often Google and has often been called the database of intentions. So it saves all your thoughts and intention. So this is the current state, or one version of the current state of social media archiving. Okay, I want to turn now to what some scholars a few years ago called the crisis in the use of web archives. So we're creating a lot of web archives in the various traditions that I spelled out, saving cyberspace, saving events, saving national webs, but where are the users? So I want to just talk a little bit about using web archives. So the typical use cases are for finding web pages that are no longer online. The file 404 problem. So that's a classic one. The other one is for evidentiary claims for the court of law, or especially trademark infringements. These are also a lot of use cases for web archives. But what about for scholarly usage or other sort of more general or opening them up to everyday users, as this speaker from the National Archive was talking about? Where are the users? I want to just illustrate one example of the so-called crisis in scholarly web use. This is one special collection. This is the papal transition of 2005, John Paul. The papal transition, And this is the page where, in the Library of Congress archive, where it says how this collection should be cited. Right? So it says, please cite it like this. If you search for that particular way in which it should be cited, in Google Scholar, for example, there are no results. So it's as if no scholar has cited. I mean, this is not necessarily exhaustive or complete. It's only an indication. But it's as if scholars aren't citing at least the way they're being asked to cite. If you go to the regular web, you'll see that there are very, very few citations, and most of them are self-citations, self-referencing. This is another one, and again, how it should be cited. This is more recent, and again, there are no citations. Now, some have called this, therefore, I mean, this is only examples, but therefore a kind of crisis in scholarly use or general use of web archives. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the ways in which we at the Digital Methods Initiative in Amsterdam and elsewhere also have devised ways in which to use web archives. And we've done that. We train something like 250 students a year in the following 4 techniques that I'm going to show you and then conclude with. And I want to also show a movie to give you an example in a second. So the first thing that we do is we take advantage of the way in which the archives are built, and especially the interfaces on top of them are built. And so we have developed a technique to take all the pages from a particular URL. So this is the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive, the classic interface for google.com. So you're searching for google.com, and then you get this. And the asterisk next to the date indicates that that's a new page, right? So that something has changed. So we created a piece of software that actually sort of screenshotted, that created screen grabs of all the asterisks, so all the pages that are different, and then stacked them like this, and then played them back like time-lapse photography. So you can see the slow evolution of a web page over time, and we've trained our students to create voiceovers to tell the story of the history of a web page in order to tell the story of the history of the web or the history of a particular institution, such as whitehouse.gov. I want to show you one example of that. It's the first movie that we've ever made. It's a kind of classic. It's the history of Google, and it's 4 minutes. If we can turn down the lights, maybe? Or maybe that's also not necessary.
This is the history of Google as seen through its interface. From the beginning, sometime in November 1998, all the way up until late 2007. These are screenshots of the Google interface taken from the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive. The history of Google is important. For some people, Google is the internet, and for many it's the first point of access. And Google, as the face of the internet, has remained virtually the same over the past 10 years. But there have been some subtle changes to the interface, so let's go back and look at this in a little bit more detail. You see initially Google with its standard web search button and its intriguing I'm feeling lucky button as being your only options. Then the directory gets introduced. with some front page fanfare. It's the Open Directory project, dmoz.org, that Google's built an engine on top of. Then come the tabs on top of the search box, with the web search being privileged at the far left, followed by images, groups, that's searching Usenet, and the directory makes it to the front page. Tab status. News, the Google News service, the news aggregator, was next. Frugal is introduced. That was that price comparison e-commerce service, and that stayed on the front page for a while, then was dropped. Followed by local, which later became Google Maps. And you see that the services are becoming more and more present. There are now 5 or 6 at the top bar, and they add a more button. And what we're interested in is which services remain on the front page and which get relegated to more or even more. Now let's look at this in some more detail. Let's look at the fate of the directory over time. It's a story of the demise of the librarian, of the demise of the human editors of the web, and the rise of the back end of the algorithm, taking over from the editors. Now you see that it's introduced with great fanfare in 2000. The web is organized by human editors. It remains on the front page. It achieves the tab status that we talked about previously. The 4th tab here. And keeps its place on the front page, even as other services are introduced. However, in 2004 something happened. It got placed under the More button. You had to click More to find the directory. And in 2006, if you clicked More, the directory wasn't there. You had to click Even More. And there you would find the directory. As it loses its standing, it also loses recognition. Perhaps people don't really remember that there is a directory, just like other services that have left the front page real estate. Also of interest are the services that climb from being even more to more and all the way to the front page. But with the directory, it's a sadder story. As the interface of Google moves upper left and you click More, you see that there's no directory any longer. And you also see that there is no Even More. So nowadays you have to search Google for its directory to find the Google directory.
Okay, I want to talk to you about the second digital method, if you will, that we've created in order to use or encourage the use of archives. This one is to create sub-collections from existing web archives. And this particular idea came from when, at the height of the Iraq War, so this was 2005, I think, 2006, something like this. We started a research project where we were thinking we could study the health of a country by looking at the health of its web. And we went to the Iraqi web.iq, and we started looking around. And what we noticed was that all the university websites were down. All the businesses were down or they'd been poached. All the governmental websites also were up, but they were all inactive and they hadn't been updated for a long, long time. The only Iraqi ministry website that was active was the Ministry of Oil, which also had a banner ad. So this was the state of the Iraqi web at the time. A couple of years later, when I was telling this story, I said, oh, let's go and make a special collection, or a collection, of the Iraqi web at the height of the Iraq War in order to illustrate this point, in order to tell this story. However, quite a lot of that material was no longer available, or was in multiple archives. So the idea was to create a means by which one could create through either a single archive or through multiple archives a collection. Now this collection, and this one of the first of its kind, we did in the Netherlands with a particular newspaper. We created a collection of right-wing extremist websites. So normally now in the national web tradition, if we save heritage only, we wouldn't want to save necessarily extreme right websites. So this is one of the issues with the national turn. However, these particular collections are of course extremely important. And we don't necessarily know what will be important later, so sometimes it's better to expand our definitions of what we consider of value on the web. The other story I would like to tell very, very briefly concerns a project that I did with some colleagues on the reconstruction of other webs. And this particular project was done by another colleague, not me, but by Anat Ben David, who reconstructed the old Yugoslav web. And this is, of course, a very interesting political project. So what was the Balkans like before the Balkan Wars, before all the great divides between Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia and the rest? What was Yugoslavia, and what was the Yugoslav web? And so these are the kinds of collections that are interesting and of value that one can try to create on the basis of existing web archives. So that's a particular technique that we train and some of our students actually do. The third one is to what I call conjure up or create or construct a past period of the web. And the example that I want to give you is from the early blogosphere. So how do you recreate the early blogosphere? Well, there is a directory called the Eaton Web, and there's a page in the Internet Archive called the Eaton Web. And on a particular date, this was, I think it was August 2001, Mr. Eaton, puts up a notice on his blog saying, there are now too many blogs being created for me to keep a list. So we decided that that particular date was the end of the early blogosphere. So what we did is we took his entire list and we queried the Internet Archive, and we looked to see what was left of the early blogosphere. And this is a picture of it. And you see that there's something like 78%, something like this, of the early blogosphere is still archived. But there's a missing middle. So we asked ourselves, well, how important are those missing websites, and how can we tell? How do we know? So what we did is we took all the archived websites and we did hyperlink analysis. So we did which websites linked to which websites then, right? So in 2000 or 1999. So this is the first case of historical hyperlink analysis. And what we were able to do was to bring back the missing websites at least onto the map. So they now become nodes. And you can see whether they were marginal or central. So it gives them, it brings them back to life, so to speak. And it also gives quite interesting information about how significant they were. We've subsequently done this for, this is the Dutch blogosphere. We've reconstructed the history of the growth of the Dutch blogosphere doing historical hyperlink analysis. We've built tools in order for you or others in order to reconstruct portions of web history through historical hyperlink analysis. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about this fourth technique, which is one that we discovered quite coincidentally when we were looking at archived websites through the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive with a piece of software installed called Ghostery. I don't know if you've heard of Ghostery. It's a browser plugin. It's one of many browser plugins that shows you what kind of trackers and third-party elements, third-party entities, trackers, cookies, etc., are on the website that you're visiting, right? This is what Ghostery does. And we had it installed, Ghostery, when we were looking at an archived web page. What we noticed was that Ghostery also showed us which trackers were on archived web pages. So we were able to begin to reconstruct the history of tracking online using archived web pages and a plugin. So this particular plugin, this Ghostery plugin, it is cumulative, so it keeps all historical trackers, and so it allows us to look at websites in a completely different way. Normally, we would think about websites, archive websites, or archive materials in terms of their content, right? In terms of the text. But here, we're looking at the code. And the code, in this case, is very valuable because it can tell us the history of tracking online, or the history is, if you want to use a kind of a broader term or a scarier term, the history of surveillance online. So what we were able to do, for example, was to take individual pages and look at the kinds of tracking that they did over time, and also collections of pages to see whether there's increased amounts of tracking of us. So outputted graphics. I mean, this is of the New York Times. The other thing, and I just want to mention this very, very briefly in conclusion, is we created now a piece of software called the Tracker, which allows you to enter either contemporary or archived historical websites into it. And what it does is it extracts the cookies and the trackers on each of the websites. You can also input a collection of websites. So what we did, this is more of a data journalism project, but I still want to show it to you. What we did is we created a list of jihadi websites. Now, again, this is a sort of special collection that is interesting to save. We wouldn't necessarily think, like as a national web archive, oh, let's save jihadi websites. But of course, this is a very interesting collection for a number of reasons. And what we did is we created a special collection of jihadi websites, and then we entered them into the Tracker software in order to see what kind of trackers they had. And yes, so we discovered that jihadi websites were all sort of relying on Western technology companies for their ads and for their revenue. And of course, once this was known, then the Google and the rest then subsequently banned these websites from using this particular their Google Ads software or double-click software. But nevertheless, this is a completely different approach and another reason to archiving websites to study the code. Okay, so what I've done very briefly for you today is given you a sense of 4 very, very specific digital methods to work with web archives in order to sort of brighten the archives or encourage use. And these particular techniques have been developed as a response to the so-called crisis of scholarly use of web archives. And each of them are actively used. As I said, there are something like 200, 250 students each year who are trained in these particular techniques, making screencast documentaries of the history of websites, making special collections, recreating a particular period of time online, also through historical hyperlink analysis, and studying websites as code. So the idea here is to encourage inventive methods, creative ways in which we can use archives. And I'm talking, of course, specifically now about web archives, but this is a larger practice of creative tool making, creative software making for the purposes of using archives. I just want to point you, if you're interested in this kind of work, I want to point you to a couple of articles here. I'll give you time if you want to take a picture of it. A couple of articles that relate directly to what I've just presented. And also, finally, which I heard during this trip, this book appeared yesterday. So this is my new book. It's called Doing Digital Methods, and there's a section on web archiving, digital methods for using web archives in creative ways. Thank you very much.
¿Tenemos alguna pregunta? ¿Algú s'anima? Sí? On? Aquí.
Hello, Neil Maria from Associació Arxivers. My question is about you said the web recording systems and screencasting. I want to know your opinion about the API from Facebook and other websites. I want to know what is the system you use for the metadata of the websites? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of social media API critique is a different lecture, huh? So this would take quite some time. But just concretely for a second, so we have built two pieces of software, a Wayback Machine link ripper. It's very simple, where you enter a single URL, and then you get all of the historical URLs from the Wayback Machine, yeah? And then there are a couple of techniques where you can compress the number, truncate the number, so you can zoom or half, or you can take only the uniques. Sorry, this is too much detail, I realize. And then we have a screenshot generator, a custom-built screenshot generator. So we take those URLs, load them into the screenshot generator, and then the Wayback Machine pages load, screenshot, and then those screenshots are compiled into a movie. So that's the way we do it. We could also use the Wayback Machine API. We could, but we don't. We could. But let me just shift to the juicier question of social media APIs and specifically Facebook. So I'm one of the scholars, Facebook scholars, who was invited by Facebook to participate in its new initiative called Social Science One, and Social Science One is Facebook's way of giving data to scientists. And what they're doing is they're offering data sets to scientists on the one hand and closing the APIs on the other hand. So all of our software that sits on top of the Facebook API is not approved. And all my colleagues' software is also not approved. So they're closing it. It's not closed yet. It still works. The Pages API of Facebook still works. But they're closing it, and they're trying to give you data. They're curating data now for you. So there are a lot of critical questions that people are posing about. So one of them is we can no longer rely on, we can't verify whether or not the collections are complete, whether they have been cleansed, right? So it's not so if I want to create a special collection of all Russian disinformation pages on Facebook, very interesting collection, right? That's gone. That's been wiped. We have some data about it. We know that they existed. We have some screenshots, etc. But we know their engagement scores and things like this. But they're now gone. I mean, they're gone. So there's a lot of calls now for creating a public archive, and Facebook has responded with creating a public archive of political ads and a new API. There's a new API for political ad archive, which is kind of interesting. But it's already been critiqued by various watchdogs for its lack of completeness, or we can't verify that it's complete. So there's a lot of critique about Facebook's API and how they're operating at the moment. I mean, there are also critiques of Twitter, less so. And YouTube is currently the most generous still. So you can, I mean, if you want to do API archiving right now with social media, YouTube is the place to do it.
Una pregunta més? Us anima? No? Tanquem? Bueno, doncs moltes gràcies al Richard Rogers, un altre aplaudiment. Thank you very much.